All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend David Dayen. David is an independent journalist whose work you can find at davedayen.com. You can also find him on Twitter at ddayen. David, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
All right, so David, Senators Sherrod Brown and, oddly enough, David Vitter, who, normally I think the man is pretty ridiculous, but for this I'll give him credit, have actually introduced a bipartisan bill to try and tackle too big to fail banks. Before we get to who opposes the bill, tell us, what exactly does their legislation call for?
Yes, it's called the Terminating Bailouts for Taxpayer Fairness Act, or the TBTF Act, an acronym often used to denote too big to fail. And basically it attacks the problem in one major way and a couple minor ways. The major way is that it attempts to add much more stringent and larger capital requirements on banks, particularly on the biggest banks in America. Right now, we're in a situation where capital is basically the amount of stock or retained earnings your company has. So at the moment, for every $100 that a bank lends out, they borrow about 97 of those dollars, and then they have $3 of that in stocks or retained earnings. So if the value of their assets falls by 4 or 5%, they're basically insolvent. So what this would do is it would extend those capital requirements. It would be 8% for smaller banks, and then once you are a bank that holds about $500 billion in assets, which is pretty much the largest 5 banks, it immediately increases to a 15% capital requirement. This just simply makes banks much safer. If they take on losses, they have the money, the liquid assets, to cover those losses. And it just prevents the need to even come up with this question of whether the government would bail out a bank, because they're not going to be insolvent in such as easy a fashion, because they have the capital reserves to cover their losses. So that's the idea behind Brown-Vitter. And the idea is that it's so onerous. Obviously, if you have a lot of capital requirements, you're not going to be able to make as many profits, because profits are all about how much you can lend out and make profit on that, and how much cheaper the cost of borrowing is. So if you have to do all this capital, you're just not going to make as high profits. So the idea is that these banks that over $500 billion will drop themselves in size voluntarily, so that they will have lower capital requirements and be able to gain more in profit. And so it solves the too big to fail problem sort of through the market.
Interesting. And so, that certainly seems like a approach one could take, and it seems like, I personally would like to see further reform, but it seems like a decent idea to begin with. However, you expect the big banks to oppose this. However, there's also some people who you would hope wouldn't oppose it, but you really shouldn't be surprised that. So who opposes this idea?
Right. So the Obama administration's Treasury Department, the week before Brown-Vitter was released, so this was April 18th, the Undersecretary for Domestic Finance, a lady named Mary Miller, came out in a public speech and basically stated that Dodd-Frank, which was the previous financial reform law that passed in 2010, has basically solved the too big to fail problem. That there isn't an issue with banks being able to borrow more cheaply because of the perception that they will simply be bailed out by the government, so investors are happy to lend to them because they know they're going to get their money back, either from the bank or from the government. And she basically challenged the notion that there is a subsidy for these big banks. She said that the system is much safer now, that the combination of international capital standards and Dodd-Frank have basically solved these problems, and everybody should go home and let Dodd-Frank get implemented further and let the Treasury do their work. So the timing of this, the fact that it came out the week before Brown-Vitter dropped, and everyone knew Brown-Vitter was coming soon, and the fact that the arguments that Miller made in that speech very much mirror arguments that the banking industry has made to rebut the kinds of ideas and opinions that are expressed within Brown-Vitter, basically shows you what side the Treasury is on here. And it's on the side of the banks, and they just don't want any further financial regulations. They basically want to stop the train right at Dodd-Frank.
So, real quick, discuss the idea that she says that the big banks aren't really receiving subsidies now, which is obviously false. But just before we move on, just explain how big banks actually are getting subsidies as far as lending rates.
Right. Well, as I said, when you have a situation where a bank is perceived as being too big to fail, and let's say you contrast that with another bank that is smaller and not perceived as systemically important, not perceived as being too big to fail. You ask the same investor to fund either one of those banks, to allow that bank to borrow money from them. And they look and they say, well, the one bank is perceived as too big to fail, so I either get my money back from the bank or I get my money back from the government. The other bank that is not perceived as too big to fail, I might get my money back from them, but if they get into trouble and the FDIC has to basically liquidate them, I'm going to lose my money. So obviously my money is safer if I put it at the too big to fail bank rather than putting it at the non too big to fail bank. And there has been social science research that has quantified this advantage, this cost of borrowing advantage for the largest banks. And it works out, if you believe certain stats, to about $83 billion a year.
Wow.
That's what the largest banks are making, essentially, based on their status. Mary Miller questions this. She uses some very questionable research, some questionable studies, and it's not credible that if you just talk to anyone in the industry, they would tell you that too big to fail is alive and well, and they would tell you that investors aren't stupid, and they would know to put their money into a too big to fail bank over one that isn't.
So let's move back to how I think the last time, or maybe the second two times ago when you were on the show, we kind of discussed how Dodd-Frank, how so much of Dodd-Frank has actually not actually been implemented because of the way it was written in a way where it's like, oh, eventually these regulations will be written and la-di-da, and eventually all this magical things will happen and unicorns will dance around and the financial industry will be safe. Obviously, that hasn't really happened yet, and the big banks are larger now than they were prior to bailout. Yeah. How can someone like that make this argument with a straight face, I guess, is sort of my first question here.
Right. I mean, from the administration's perspective, the president campaigned on this as part of his legacy, part of his first-term record, that he passed these sweeping financial reforms. So for them to come back and say, well, we actually need this other overhaul that's exemplified by Brown-Vitter to really make the financial system safe, it would be a hard thing for them to say, because basically they'd be tacitly admitting that their initial large sweeping financial reform didn't do a whole lot. The truth is that it didn't do a whole lot. The truth is that only a third of the Dodd-Frank rules have been implemented to this point. Even those rules that have been implemented have been subject to litigation, very skillful litigation by the financial industry, and subject to regulatory capture and gutting of the rules that have been implemented through bank lobbying. So I think the tell here is that Mary Miller is saying, well, Dodd-Frank worked and it made the financial system a lot safer. And that mirrors what these bank lobbyists are saying, that Dodd-Frank worked and make us a lot safer. These are the same bank lobbyists who have tirelessly fought financial reform every step of the way. If those two sides are in agreement, I think that's a very revealing sign as to what Dodd-Frank really does to the financial system. And Treasury just doesn't want to admit it.